Peter Parker has just begun a new job at Horizon Labs when the company is suddenly attacked by a villain known as the Hobgoblin. Using his goblin laugh, which is some sort of directed sonic attack, the villain is able to pin Spider-Man to the ground and nearly has him with his flaming sword. Luckily, Bella Fishback is able to deduce the nature of the goblin laughter and has the Horizon Labs speakers play some Lady Gaga music, disrupting the effect of the goblin's laughter. With this, Spider-Man is able to recover and knock Hobgoblin down. With the Hobgoblin on a mission, he takes off. Spider-Man thanks the other scientists at Horizon Labs for helping him out before he pursues the villain. Spider-Man is unable to catch the Hobgoblin, who escapes with a sample of artificial vibranium being developed at the lab. Outside, the Horizon scientists regroup and realize the new guy, this Peter Parker kid, is missing. They rush back into the lab looking for him, and Spider-Man, who only has moments to change out of his costume, is forced to be discovered working in his underwear with headphones on, claiming to have not heard the entire attack. This embarrassing moment is enough that the Horizon scientists and police don't even give the excuse a second thought. Elsewhere, at the Fist building, the Hobgoblin arrives with the artificial vibranium, also known as reverbium, in tow. There is one problem though. The Kingpin and his underlings recognize that this is not the Hobgoblin they sent, and Wilson Fisk demands to know what happened to Roderick Kingsley. The Hobgoblin only says that he's in a better place. Hobgoblin heaven, if you will, and that he's the new Hobgoblin. The Kingpin considers this an addition then, and accepts this new Hobgoblin as an underling. The next morning at Horizon Labs, the owner of the company, Max, realizes now that this artificial vibranium, whether they intended it to be or not, is going to be used to create a terrible weapon. He orders the material destroyed by Antarctic vibranium, the antimetal that dissolves all metals known to man. When Peter asks about this antimetal, Max agrees to put aside some samples for him, requesting that Peter develop further samples to deal with this reverbium, figuring that now that this metal is out there in the world, it's their problem and they're the ones who should fix it. He only wishes there was some way they could steal this metal back. Peter, thinking to himself, realizes he knows a world-class thief and calls Felicia Hardy. The Black Cat agrees to help Spider-Man look into this theft, though she's a little annoyed Spider-Man's only calling because he needs some professional help. Elsewhere at the Daily Bugle, Phil Urich, nephew of famed reporter Ben Urich, comes by with some exclusive footage of the Hobgoblin and his attack on Horizon Labs. Though he gives the exclusive to a reporter named Nora, when her boyfriend stops by, Phil quickly gets jealous and leaves, feeling resentful about the whole thing, and swearing the next Hobgoblin story he delivers is going to be even bigger than this one. At Horizon Labs, Peter is working on a new Spider-Man suit in order to catch the new Hobgoblin by surprise. He's then informed that he has two guests, and Carly Cooper, his girlfriend, and Mary Jane, his ex-wife, are both outside of his private lab waiting to greet him. Though Peter is worried this is awkward, Carly was simply stopping by to visit while Mary Jane saw the attack on Horizon Labs on TV and wanted to make sure Peter was okay herself. The conversation is pleasant as a whole, though Mary Jane has trouble keeping up with the high-concept scientific talk between Peter and Carly and feels a bit left out. Peter then receives a call from Felicia, who captured a goon and was able to torture him into revealing that the Hobgoblin stole the artificial vibranium on behalf of Kingpin. Though she was reluctant to participate in all this before, now that the Kingpin's involved, she's all too happy to steal from the powerful mobster, and agrees to help retrieve the artificial vibranium. Spider-Man says he'll meet up with her, saying that he'll be dressing specifically for the occasion. As Felicia goes to meet with him, she fails to notice the Hobgoblin was watching the whole affair. On a nearby rooftop, the Black Cat waits for Spider-Man, only for a package to have been left for her. She finds the box contains strange goggles, and when she puts it on, she's surprised to find Spider-Man standing right in front of her. The hero introduces her to his brand new stealth suit, and it should make the upcoming heist a piece of cake. The Black Hat warns Spider-Man not to get cocky. These things are never that easy. But Peter reminds her that they even have the element of surprise. Or do they? Hello and welcome to Comic Island. My name is Arden, and this is my recap and review of The Amazing Spider-Man number 650. Alright, so next up is a pretty interesting comic. And into the Dan Slott era, known for how long he wrote for this comic and for having Peter Parker being single again, and dealing with working for Horizon Labs and later his own company, actually taking advantage of his vast scientific knowledge and ability in his professional life. It's a pretty interesting comic overall, and dealing with Big Time, a larger meta-narrative story in Spider-Man lore that basically is all about establishing this new Spider-Man post One More Day, with most people not knowing his secret identity, him now being separate from Mary Jane, and having a more of a professional role and being more of a larger scale superhero on a level that as Spider-Man Peter hadn't reached before, but it feels like by now in his history was overdue for his character. I have to say, on the whole, I do like Big Time. While I have a lot of issues with how Dan Slott wrote Spider-Man and the larger editorial climate surrounding this character during this time period, Big Time did a good job at selling this new Spider-Man and promising a new direction that actually progressed his character forward in a fun and interesting way. It was different from all the other Spider-Man comics we talked about so far, and really was moving him away from long-established norms in Spider-Man canon. But a direction that felt right given that Spider-Man had invented things like web slingers and a host of other incredibly amazing gadgets that helped him fight crime on a day-to-day basis. He should be the kind of smart person who can work in his own lab on the level of all these top-tier scientists at Horizon, which is what this comic does a good job showing. And the humor really matches that too. I really thought it was funny, and it really is kind of a classic Spider-Man moment now, when Peter was forced to basically let himself get caught in his underwear working with headphones so as to avoid suspicion about his dual identity as Spider-Man. That's a great moment, and it really had me laughing, even though I've read this comic before, when I reread it for this review. There's a good amount of that in this comic, though with every joke like that, there's a lot of jokes that really didn't work for me and were really on the nose or repetitive, and Dan Slott really has an issue with being so overt in his writing. When Mary Jane and Carly Cooper show up for an awkward lunch, it would have been better if he didn't spell out how awkward it was. Lacking all that subtlety, this comic is a little disappointing. The character work is where it really misfires, because on the whole, it's pretty good with its action and how it introduces Spider-Man's new stealth suit. That's a good example of what I was saying about what Big Time's all about, is moving these things forward and establishing this new status quo for Spider-Man. And that stuff it does really well. The characters, though, are where it's lacking. Carly Cooper really doesn't have this chemistry with Peter that doesn't feel forced. When they're giddily talking about science stuff with each other, it's from the perspective of Mary Jane, so we're not really meant to empathize with that situation. And while I like this comic on the whole, it's really hard to get through this thing without thinking of the fact that while Big Time is all about setting up this new status quo about Spider-Man, we've seen all of Dan Slott's run with this character now, and we know for a fact that all this stuff about Peter Parker becoming a more successful entrepreneur and setting out on his own, single again for the first time in decades, would go nowhere. Carly Cooper would be sort of written out of the story in a year or two, without any meaningful replacement in terms of a love interest, and all this stuff about Peter Parker either working for Horizon Labs or later as a CEO would ultimately go nowhere. There's a lot of missed potential here too. Peter Parker becoming his own CEO or big-time scientist that had a lot of professional success has a lot of cool aspects of it that could have made for a good story. Perhaps this change in Peter's life would lead to him becoming more arrogant or more like Tony Stark, only for that to ultimately burn all the personal relationships Peter has in his life and for him to start feeling fundamentally alone. And then when the chips were to go down, as it always inevitably does in Spider-Man's life, he'd find there was no one and would have to find a different direction in his life going forward. Or they could have gone in the direction that they had been going in pre-One More Day, where Spider-Man wasn't so much becoming a success in his professional life as Peter Parker, but as Spider-Man. And he became an Avenger, and even as Peter Parker started to become more involved in Tony Stark's life and company. As is even acknowledged here in issue number 650, there was a time when the Parkers were all living in the Avengers Tower, and in my opinion, that's one of my favorite time periods in all of Spider-Man history. While Hubert Ramos does a really great job of making this comic feel like it's come to life, in fact, after the dark drudgery of the Changes comic I had just reviewed, this was a really nice change of pace, and at first I just felt like there was this energy to these comics that Hubert was bringing that we hadn't felt in any of these Mary Jane reviews so far. But like the rest of this comic, it's hard to forget the rest of Dan Slott's writing and his time with Spider-Man when reading this comic, considering it's all about establishing Dan Slott as the future direction for Spider-Man and this character. We're in the 2010s at this point, and until Nick Spencer takes over, which by the way only happened last year, I have a lot of issues with Spider-Man's writing and how this character was treated in this particular decade. People will criticize the 90s for how they treated Spider-Man, but we had a pretty good time with the 1990s comics we got out of these random Mary Jane reviews. I do have my issues with how 90s Spider-Man was treated, but they pale in comparison to the Dan Slott era, which feels like it just scooped out all the love and happiness of Spider-Man comics and threw it away for jokey, surface-level action and very weak, drawn-out character development. It's remarkable, even compared to the 2000s comic we did as part of these reviews, how little story there is in number 650. There's some stuff there, but by and large, it's very compact compared to what we've been seeing before. Especially compared to Jerry Conway, who could just pack in so much plot in a single issue. It really feels like Dan Slott has trouble keeping things truncated. It's something that I've actually observed in other reviews of Dan Slott comics over the years. He takes a remarkable amount of time to convey very little information. And that's exactly what happened here. Because after a strong start, we basically are left with a very simple thing of Peter finding out that Kingpin was the one who was behind the theft at Horizon Labs, and then him meeting up with Black Cat to go after them. The fact of the matter is, the vast majority of the comic is dedicated to that very simple plot summary I just gave, and while normally a good writer could fill that with good character work, this is where Dan Slott fails at most strongly in this comic, is writing these characters in a compelling or interesting way. All these characters feel like cardboard cutouts of much more well-formed characters that we've come to know from the comics through other writers over the years. So no, I don't think I recommend this comic. If you're a die-hard Spider-Man fan and want to see the origins of Spider-Man's stealth suit, what little time this comic does spend on introducing that suit, it is here if you want to check it out for yourself. But like the rest of Big Time, I will remind you that this stealth suit is hardly ever used again for any meaningful purpose throughout Dan Slott's run as the Spider-Man writer. So like all these things and new concepts being introduced in Big Time, I really do question the point of it all. Because you can have a good setup story, but it really doesn't stand up well on its own. Whether or not that setup is going to be worth your time is entirely determinant on whether or not there's meaningful payoff in the future, and we know for a fact there isn't. Now that Nick Spencer's taken over as Spider-Man's writer, it's a little easier to look back on this stuff without any frustration. But that being said, having come back to it, having read Nick Spencer's Spider-Man and seeing it full of this life and love that I just said was missing from Dan Slott's writing of Spider-Man, I'm not any more charitable to this comic than I was before. I still really feel like Dan Slott's era and time with Spider-Man was lacking. It's telling, for example, that Nick Spencer had to go and basically fix Black Cat's character because Dan Slott had done so much damage to her during the Superior Spider-Man era. So that leaves us with one final comic and one more issue out of this decade as part of these random reviews for Mary Jane. And as for this final issue, well, I won't give it away here, but when I found out what was going to be the final issue we'd be reviewing as part of these random reviews for Mary Jane, my jaw dropped to the floor. It's a comic we haven't reviewed yet, even though we are getting into the era where Joey and I have reviewed a lot of these Spider-Man comics. But it's a big one that would change the story and history of Spider-Man forever. So stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep reading comics.